Well, welcome back, everyone. I'm Ted Earhart. Here we are, part 3 of our discussion on cryptocurrencies. As I said previously, I originally had planned on just one short video on this subject, but I've just found it impossible to whittle anything down in under 10 minutes. There are so many facets and dimensions to this subject, and it's pretty fascinating, actually. So I ended up breaking this up, and here we are with 3 videos. The first 2, just to recap real briefly, well, in the first video we talked about the main features and benefits that proponents of cryptocurrency often discuss. In part 2, I laid out what I think are some of the biggest issues as it relates to whether or not this will realistically gain broad adoption or not. In part 3, we're going to take a look at this from an investment angle, and I'm going to discuss some of the things I think about, at least as someone who subscribes to the principles of value investing, how I think about that in the context of cryptocurrency. So stick with me. Let's get started. Now, when it comes to thinking about cryptocurrencies in the context of investing, this really brings me back to something foundational that Warren Buffett's been talking about for years, and that's really this distinction between so-called productive assets and non-productive assets, or in other words, commodities. Now, in the left-hand column, you can see some examples of what we generally call productive assets. Those are things like businesses, real estate, and bonds. And the defining characteristic here is all these things actually produce something for their owners. So, for instance, businesses ideally produce profits or dividends. Real estate produces rents, leases, yields from crops, things of that nature. Bonds obviously generate interest income, although not much in today's interest rate environment. But all these things produce cash flows at some level to their owners, and therefore they're producing something. And they can therefore also be valued by different methodologies. They have, in other words, some type of intrinsic value, something that we can appraise and kind of actually judge. Now, of course, on the right-hand side here, in the right-hand column, what we would call non-productive assets, the difference here is these things really have no intrinsic value. You think about this in the context of like a brick of gold, for example. Well, you can have a brick of gold in your safe at home, but what is that brick of gold doing for you? And the same thing might be true for some piece of classic art that's hanging on your wall. Those things can sit there and look good, but they're not doing anything for you, i.e. they have no intrinsic value. And the same, of course, is true for currencies, whether it's sovereign currencies or cryptocurrencies. So when I think about this from a value investing perspective, one of the biggest issues is how do you put a price on any of these things? At the end of the day, price is only going to be determined by supply and demand fundamentals, and that's really when we think about commodities or non-productive assets. At the end of the day, you're really speculating on whether or not there's going to be increased demand for some unit in the future. Now, if you are someone who says, okay, Ted, I get this productive assets versus commodities thing, but I don't really care. I think this technology is going to have staying power and I want to ride the wave. Okay, that's fine. My question to you then to think about is, so which cryptocurrencies are you going to choose? Because when we look up here, you're just looking at the top 10. Ranked by market value. But here's the thing, there's literally thousands of these things in existence today. Because at the most fundamental level, all these things is just computer code. Okay, if you're someone who can write code, you can create a cryptocurrency. And obviously my point is, unless you really have some expertise in understanding all the variations of these different versions of these things are networks essentially, how are you going to make any informed decision about which one of these is going to survive? And in fact, I'll point out the founder of Ethereum, I heard him say recently, and I've heard others say that, realistically, probably only makes sense that a couple dozen of these exist. So just if you assume he's right, that means probably 99% of the cryptocurrencies in existence today probably aren't worth anything. And furthermore, someone else said something. The person was Stanley Druckenmiller. He's one of the greatest investors in history. He's been dabbling in this area a little bit, and he made the point which struck me is he's like, I'm open to the idea that this could be an important development, that some of these cryptocurrencies could really take off. But he's like, I'm also open to the idea that the winners haven't even been invented yet. And there's plenty of historical parallels or analogies to what we're discussing here. And the best one I could come up with is computer operating systems. You can go on Wikipedia and look up the history of operating systems. Here's a snapshot of the 60s and 70s, but these things go all the way back to the 50s. And at the end of the day, where we reside here in 2021 is basically the world operates off the Windows operating system and Apple's version of an operating system. So all these other ones are dead. So anyway, my point is, of course, we have this top 10 list today. Here are the big names, but to try to guess which one will succeed, if any of those succeed, is, I think, an almost impossible challenge, even if you're some of the people that are right at the heart of this developing technology. All right, well, we've covered a ton of ground on this subject of cryptocurrencies, and I'm sure you're kind of trying to read through the lines and interpret what my view is on this subject. And I think I've articulated pretty clearly that, from an investment perspective, I think this area is extremely speculative. And I personally would not put any money in this that you're not willing to literally go to zero. And that's just due to the nature of what we discussed in part 3 here, the fact that these are as pure of a commodity as one could think about. Like I said, at the end of the day, these things really just represent computer code. There's no intrinsic value, therefore it's difficult to assess a price. And the other issue, of course, that kind of layered on top is these things are technologies. I think it's very possible that a lot of what exists today, maybe all, will no longer exist in 10 years. I don't know, but if we look at historical parallels, I think that's quite possible. Now, I do want to conclude by recommending a couple podcasts. The podcast is done by Lex Friedman, and you can find this on YouTube. Two that I found especially intriguing were interviews he did with Vitalik Buterin. He is the founder of Ethereum, and this Charles Hoskinson, who actually worked with Buterin. I think they had a falling out, and he's gone on to start his own version of cryptocurrency, what is today known as Cardano. But I found it absolutely fascinating listening to these two guys, because you could tell that these guys are basically probably borderline geniuses, super smart in mathematics and computer coding and so on. And frankly, it really gave me a much greater respect and appreciation for the underlying blockchain technology, which is what these guys are experts in. And I've come to the conclusion that technology seems like it's very likely to have staying power, and we'll probably see it more and more in our everyday lives. But I think it's quite possible that it's going to develop in ways that no one really even can foresee today. So, for instance, I think one case might be that cryptocurrencies themselves might not be such a big thing. They might kind of fizzle out, but the blockchain is applied to other areas and industries that no one is even talking about today. And both of these guys allude to some of that in these podcasts, which was rather intriguing. So if you're interested in this further, I'd highly recommend you spend some time checking out those podcasts. It was really influential in my view on this entire subject. But if you follow along through all 3 parts, I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to chat with me, feel free to reach out. But as always, appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you next time.